The Crimson Sons of Vaelthera cast long shadows across the sprawling military academy as Marcus Chun stepped off the transport vessel, his worn duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The humid air hit him like a wall, thick with the scent of exotic flora and the metallic tang of advanced technology. Around him, beings from dozens of different worlds moved with purpose through the gleaming corridors of the Galactic Defense Institute, their conversations a symphony of clicks, whistles, and harmonic tones that his universal translator struggled to interpret. At 19 standard years old, Marcus was average height for a human, with dark hair kept regulation short and intelligent brown eyes that took in every detail of his new surroundings. His simple gray uniform marked him as a first-year cadet, fresh from the backwater world of Earth. To the other species present, he appeared unremarkable, even primitive by galactic standards. The Galactic Defense Institute stood as the premier military academy in known space, drawing the finest warriors and tacticians from across 700-member worlds of the Galactic Confederation. Its towering spires reached toward the sky like metallic fingers, each one housing different departments dedicated to space warfare, planetary defense, xenobiology, and advanced combat techniques. The Academy had produced legendary commanders who had shaped the course of galactic history for over 3 millennia. As Marcus navigated the registration process, he became acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed him. A group of Zinthri cadets, their reptilian features twisted in what might have been amusement, pointed clawed fingers in his direction. Their scales shifted color in patterns that his translator informed him corresponded to derisive laughter. Nearby, a cluster of Valdorian students, tall and ethereal with their translucent skin and multiple arms, observed him with what appeared to be scientific curiosity, as if he were an interesting specimen rather than a fellow cadet. The registration hall buzzed with activity as hundreds of new cadets processed through biometric scanners and received their dormitory assignments. Marcus presented his acceptance documents to a bored-looking Thraxian clerk, whose 6 eyes barely glanced at the paperwork before stamping it with mechanical precision. The clerk's mandibles clicked in what Marcus had learned was the equivalent of a dismissive grunt. Dormitory Block 7, Level 3, Room 347. The clerk announced in heavily accented Standard Galactic. Orientation begins at 0800 hours tomorrow. Try not to embarrass your species too badly, Terran. Marcus bit back his initial response and simply nodded, collecting his materials and heading toward the dormitory complex. The corridors were a marvel of engineering, with walls that seemed to pulse with their own inner light and floors that adjusted their surface texture based on the species walking upon them. Holographic displays provided directions in dozens of languages, while automated service drones glided silently overhead. His dormitory room turned out to be a compact but efficiently designed space with 2 beds, study areas, and a shared refreshment alcove. His roommate had already arrived and was unpacking what appeared to be ceremonial weapons and ornate armor. The being turned as Marcus entered, revealing the proud features of a Corvaxi warrior caste member. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with bronze-colored skin marked by intricate tattoos that told the story of his lineage, Thaxvor embodied everything the galaxy considered the ideal military candidate. "So, you are the human," Thaxvor said, his voice carrying the formal cadence of his people. "I had hoped for a roommate from a more established military tradition." Marcus set down his bag and extended his hand in the traditional human greeting gesture. "Marcus Chun, I'm looking forward to working with you." Thaxvor stared at the offered hand for a moment before turning back to his unpacking without acknowledging the gesture. "The Corvaxi have been warriors for 10,000 years. We have conquered 17 star systems and brought order to chaos wherever we have ventured. What military traditions do the Terrans claim?" The question stung because Marcus knew the answer would only reinforce the prejudices already forming around him. Earth had only achieved faster-than-light travel 40 years ago, making humanity the newest member of the Galactic Confederation. While humans had a long history of warfare on their homeworld, it paled in comparison to the vast interstellar conflicts that had shaped the other species for millennia. "We're still developing our place in galactic military doctrine," Marcus replied diplomatically. "But humans have always adapted quickly to new challenges." Thaxvor's laugh was harsh and brief. "Adaptation. Yes, I suppose that is one way to describe an experience." Over the following days, Marcus discovered that his roommate's attitude was far from unique. During their first tactical assessment, led by Commander HFY, a veteran Zinthri officer whose scarred hide spoke of countless battles, the cadets were divided into squads and given a simulated planetary defense scenario. The exercise took place in a massive holographic chamber that could recreate any battlefield environment with startling realism. Marcus found himself assigned to Squad Theta, along with 2 Valdorians, a Thraxian, and a Korvaxi cadet named Zexhai, who regarded him with barely concealed contempt. The scenario involved defending a mining colony from a pirate raid, requiring coordination between ground forces and orbital defense platforms. "The humans should handle supply logistics," Zexhai announced without consulting the others. "It requires no actual tactical skill." The Valdorians, Yexhana, and Teldoran communicated in rapid harmonic tones before Teldoran spoke. "Our species has natural spatial awareness that makes us ideal for orbital coordination. Perhaps the Terran could manage equipment maintenance." Marcus felt his jaw clench, but forced himself to speak calmly. "I'd like to contribute to the tactical planning. I've studied the scenarios extensively." The Thraxian, whose name Marcus had learned was Clicktar, made a sound that the translator interpreted as scoffing. "Study is not the same as instinct, human. Our species has been fighting space battles since before your world had achieved metallurgy." As the simulation began, Marcus watched his teammates implement a standard defensive strategy that he recognized from his extensive study of galactic military doctrine. It was competent, but predictable, following established patterns that any experienced pirate commander would anticipate. He tried to offer suggestions for modifications that could exploit weaknesses in the attacking force's formation, but his teammates dismissed his input without consideration. The result was a technical victory, but at a significant cost in simulated casualties and infrastructure damage. As they debriefed after the exercise, Commander SYX's analysis was blunt. Squad Theta achieved the objective, but demonstrated poor adaptability and excessive reliance on standard doctrine. In a real conflict, such rigidity would have resulted in catastrophic losses. The commander's eyes fixed on Marcus as he continued. Interestingly, the human cadet identified several tactical opportunities that were ignored by his teammates. While his suggestions showed promise, his failure to effectively communicate and assert leadership contributed to the overall poor performance. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks as his squad mates shot him accusatory glances. After the session, Zexhai cornered him in the corridor outside the simulation chamber. "Do not think that having the instructor notice your academic theories makes you a warrior, human," the Korvaxi growled, his voice low and threatening. "When real combat comes, your soft species will crack under pressure like glass." Word of the incident spread quickly through the cadet population, and Marcus found himself increasingly isolated. In the academy's vast cafeteria, conversations would stop when he approached, only to resume in whispered tones after he passed. During physical training sessions, his human physiology made him appear weak compared to species that had evolved on high-gravity worlds or in environments that naturally selected for physical prowess. The social dynamics of the Academy reflected broader galactic attitudes toward humanity. Earth's rapid technological advancement had been impressive, but it had also been largely derivative, building upon scientific principles and technologies shared by more established civilizations. Many species viewed humans as useful junior partners at best, or potential security risks at worst due to their aggressive history and rapid expansion. These prejudices were not without some foundation. Humanity's first contact with galactic civilization had occurred during a border skirmish between the Confederation and a rogue faction of Zinthri separatists. A human exploration vessel had inadvertently provided crucial intelligence that helped resolve the conflict, but not before demonstrating what many considered humanity's concerning tendency toward violent solutions. Marcus threw himself into his studies with renewed determination, spending long hours in the Academy's vast library complex absorbing everything he could about galactic military history, alien psychology, and advanced tactical theory. The library was a marvel in itself, containing the accumulated military knowledge of hundreds of civilizations spanning thousands of years. Holographic displays could recreate historical battles in perfect detail, allowing students to walk through famous engagements and analyze the decisions that shaped their outcomes. It was during one of these late-night study sessions that Marcus first encountered Kithra the Unbroken, though not in person. He was reviewing historical accounts of the Valdorian-Thraxian War, a brutal conflict that had raged for nearly 2 centuries before the formation of the Galactic Confederation, when he stumbled across references to a legendary figure known throughout warrior cultures across the galaxy. Kithra belonged to a species called the Ashkor, beings of incredible physical and mental prowess who were renowned as the finest warriors in known space. The Ashkor rarely involved themselves in galactic politics, preferring to remain in their isolated star systems, but when they did emerge, their impact was invariably significant. Kithra had earned her reputation during the Void Wars, a catastrophic conflict against an extragalactic invasion force that had threatened all sentient life in the galaxy. The historical records painted a picture of a warrior without equal, possessing both devastating combat skills and brilliant tactical insight. She had single-handedly turned the tide of multiple battles, earning the respect and fear of allies and enemies alike. Her title, the Unbroken, referred not only to her undefeated record in combat, but also to her unshakable will and refusal to yield in the face of impossible odds. What intrigued Marcus most about Kithra was not her legendary status, but the tactical innovations she had pioneered. Unlike most military leaders who relied on overwhelming force or established doctrine, she had consistently achieved victory through unconventional strategies that exploited unexpected weaknesses in enemy formations. Her approach to warfare seemed to transcend species-specific thinking, incorporating elements from dozens of different military traditions to create entirely new tactical paradigms. As Marcus delved deeper into the historical accounts, he began to understand that Kithra represented something unique in galactic military culture. While most species had developed their martial traditions in isolation, refining techniques that worked well for their specific physiological and psychological characteristics, she had synthesized knowledge from across the spectrum of galactic civilization. Her success had come not from adherence to any single military doctrine, but from her ability to think beyond the limitations that constrained others. The more Marcus studied her methods, the more he began to see parallels with humanity's own approach to problem-solving. Throughout their history, humans had shown a remarkable ability to adapt and synthesize knowledge from different sources, creating innovations that transcended their individual components. It was this same synthetic thinking that had allowed them to achieve faster-than-light travel in mere decades after first contact, while some species had required centuries to develop similar capabilities. Marcus began to wonder if humanity's supposed weakness might actually be a strength that the galactic military establishment was too rigid to recognize. While other species approached warfare through the lens of their traditional methods, humans had the potential to see beyond those limitations and create entirely new approaches to military challenges. His growing confidence was put to the test during the Academy's monthly war games, large-scale exercises that pitted squads of cadets against each other in complex scenarios designed to test every aspect of their military training. The upcoming exercise was particularly significant, as it would involve all first-year cadets and carry substantial weight in their overall evaluation. The scenario involved a disputed star system with multiple inhabited worlds, where competing factions sought to establish control through military force. Each squad would represent a different faction, with victory determined by a combination of territorial control, resource acquisition, and strategic objectives completed over the course of a week-long simulation. Marcus found himself assigned to Squad Omega, widely considered one of the weakest groups in the first-year class. His teammates included a Thraxian named Zixkala who had failed several previous exercises, a Valdorian called Nextera who was brilliant at individual tasks but struggled with teamwork, and a Korvaxi warrior named Grakon who possessed great physical prowess but lacked strategic thinking skills. The squad assignments had clearly been made to group together cadets who were considered underperforming or problematic, creating what the instructors probably viewed as a control group that would highlight the superiority of the more traditionally successful teams. Squad Alpha, by contrast, included the top performers from each species, including Thaxvor and Zexhai, the Korvaxi cadets who had consistently dismissed Marcus's abilities. As Squad Omega gathered for their initial planning session, the mood was distinctly pessimistic. Zixkala's mandibles clicked nervously as he reviewed their assigned starting position, a resource-poor system on the periphery of the simulation area. Nextera's harmonic speech patterns carried undertones of resignation that even Marcus could detect without his translator. Grakon simply sat in brooding silence, apparently convinced that their failure was predetermined. "We are doomed," Zixkala announced with characteristic Thraxian directness. "Our starting position is defensively weak, our resource base is inadequate, and our opponents include the strongest squads in the academy. The instructors have clearly assigned us this position to demonstrate the consequences of poor performance." Marcus studied the tactical display showing their starting situation and the disposition of other squads throughout the simulated star system. While their position was indeed challenging, he began to see possibilities that his teammates had missed. Their location on the periphery, while resource-poor, offered strategic advantages that could be exploited by unconventional thinking. "What if being underestimated is actually our greatest asset?" Marcus asked, causing his teammates to look at him with expressions ranging from confusion to incredulity. Nextera's harmonic tones carried a note of curiosity. "Explain your reasoning, human." Marcus activated the tactical display and began highlighting key features of their strategic situation. "Everyone expects us to fail, which means they won't allocate significant resources to defending against us. While the strong squads focus on fighting each other for control of the central systems, we can move through the periphery and establish control over territories they consider worthless." He zoomed in on several star systems that other squads had dismissed as strategically irrelevant. These systems may be resource-poor individually, but they control key hyperspace routes. If we can establish a network of bases throughout the periphery, we can control trade and movement throughout the entire simulation area. Grakon leaned forward, his warrior instincts responding to the possibility of an unconventional strategy. "You propose to win through commerce rather than conquest." "I propose we win by changing the rules of engagement," Marcus replied. "While our opponents fight traditional battles for traditional objectives, we build an economic and logistical empire that makes their victories meaningless." The strategy that Marcus outlined drew inspiration from historical human conflicts where smaller forces had achieved victory through asymmetric warfare and economic disruption. Rather than meeting their opponents in direct military confrontation, Squad Omega would focus on controlling the infrastructure that made large-scale military operations possible. Zixkala's compound eyes glittered with growing interest as he began to understand the implications. "The other squads will exhaust their resources fighting each other, while we establish an unassailable position throughout the periphery. By the time they recognize the threat, it will be too late to effectively counter our strategy." For the first time since the exercise had been announced, Marcus felt a surge of optimism. His teammates were beginning to see past their initial prejudices and consider the possibilities that unconventional thinking could offer. More importantly, They were starting to work together as a cohesive unit rather than a collection of individual failures. The week-long simulation began with the expected pattern of aggressive moves by the strongest squads. Squad Alpha launched an immediate assault on the resource-rich central systems, while other high-performing teams moved to secure key strategic positions. The Academy's observation deck was crowded with instructors and senior cadets watching the initial deployments, and Marcus could hear dismissive comments about Squad Omega's apparently timid response. While their competitors engaged in spectacular battles for control of heavily defended positions, Squad Omega quietly began implementing their peripheral strategy. They established small, inconspicuous bases throughout the outer systems, focusing on logistics and infrastructure rather than military strength. To outside observers, their activities appeared to represent the cautious movements of a weak force trying to avoid direct confrontation. Marcus coordinated the overall strategy, while his teammates each took responsibility for different aspects of the operation. Zixgala's natural aptitude for logistics proved invaluable in establishing efficient supply networks, while Nextera's analytical skills helped optimize their resource allocation across multiple systems. Grakon's warrior background provided crucial insights into defensive positioning and the psychological aspects of their deception strategy. The real test came on the third day of the simulation, when Squad Alpha's aggressive expansion brought them into contact with Squad Omega's outer perimeter. Faxvor, commanding Alpha's forces, initially dismissed the encounter as insignificant, expecting to sweep aside what he viewed as a minor obstacle to his continued expansion. Instead, he found himself facing a series of small, but perfectly positioned defensive installations that made direct assault prohibitively expensive. When he attempted to bypass them and strike at what he assumed were Squad Omega's primary bases, he discovered that their true strength lay in their distributed network rather than any single stronghold. Marcus watched the tactical display with growing excitement as Squad Alpha's offensive momentum stalled against their unconventional defense. Every assault that Faxvor launched was met not with traditional defensive responses, but with economic and logistical countermeasures that undermined his ability to sustain large-scale operations. The battle for the Kepler mining station marked the turning point that would reshape not only the war game, but the entire perception of human tactical doctrine at the Galactic Defense Institute. What began as a seemingly minor skirmish between Squad Alpha and Squad Omega had drawn the attention of every instructor and senior cadet in the Academy, as Marcus Chen's unconventional strategy continued to confound the established military thinking of the galaxy's finest warriors. Commander SYX Tall stood at the primary observation deck, his scarred Zenthari features betraying none of the fascination he felt while watching the tactical display. Beside him, Admiral Krexthon of the Valdorian Space Command and General Mordak, representing the Korvaxi War Council, observed in stunned silence, as their most promising cadets found themselves systematically outmaneuvered by what they had dismissively labeled the Failure Squad. The Kepler station itself was strategically insignificant, a minor mining operation in the outer rim that processed low-grade asteroids for basic industrial materials. Under normal circumstances, no military commander would waste resources securing such a marginal asset. However, Marcus had recognized that the station's position along a major hyperspace trade route made it far more valuable than its resource output would suggest. Faxvor had approached the station with overwhelming force, expecting to sweep aside Squad Omega's token resistance and use the facility as a staging ground for deeper penetration into the Outer Rim territories. His assault force consisted of 3 heavy cruisers and a full regiment of Korvaxi shock troops, more than sufficient to overwhelm any conventional defense that the station could mount. Instead of meeting the assault head-on, Marcus had evacuated most of the station's defensive forces while leaving behind a small garrison equipped with advanced sensor equipment and communication arrays. As Squad Alpha's forces moved in to occupy the facility, they found themselves in possession of what appeared to be a significant strategic asset, unaware that they had walked into an elaborate trap. The trap was not military in the traditional sense, but economic and logistical. Squad Omega had spent the previous days establishing a network of seemingly insignificant supply depots and communication relays throughout the Outer Rim, creating what Marcus privately called his spider web strategy. Each individual installation was too small to warrant serious attention from the major powers, but collectively they formed an integrated system that could monitor and influence all traffic moving through the periphery. With Squad Alpha committed to holding the Kepler station, Marcus activated the next phase of his strategy. The supply routes that Thaxvor's forces depended upon passed through territories now under Squad Omega's indirect control. Rather than attacking these supply convoys directly, Marcus implemented a series of administrative delays and customs inspections that slowed the flow of resources to a trickle. Zixkala, monitoring the operation from Squad Omega's hidden command center, reported on the effectiveness of their economic warfare. Squad Alpha supply efficiency has dropped by 60% over the past 18 hours. Their fuel reserves are approaching critical levels, and their ammunition stocks are insufficient for sustained operations. NextEra's harmonic analysis provided additional insights into their opponent's growing desperation. Intercepted communications indicate that Thaxvor is requesting emergency resupply from the Central Command, but the other major squads are too engaged in their own operations to provide assistance. Squad Alpha is becoming strategically isolated despite their apparent tactical success. The genius of Marcus's approach lay in its multi-layered nature. While other squads focused on controlling territory through military force, Squad Omega had quietly gained control over the economic infrastructure that made military operations possible. They had turned the simulation's underlying economic model into a weapon more powerful than any direct assault. Grakhan, whose warrior culture had initially made him skeptical of such indirect tactics, now found himself genuinely impressed by the strategy's effectiveness. This approach requires tremendous discipline and long-term thinking. Most warriors will be tempted to seek immediate glory through direct combat, but you have created a victory that becomes more certain with each passing hour. Marcus felt a surge of pride at his teammates' recognition, but he also knew that their success was far from guaranteed. Squad Alpha was commanded by some of the finest military minds in the Academy, and Thaxvor had already begun to recognize the true nature of their situation. The Korvaxi commander was now desperately seeking a way to break free from the economic trap that Squad Omega had constructed around his forces. The solution that Thaxvor devised demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and his fundamental misunderstanding of the new paradigm that Marcus had introduced to the simulation. Rather than attempting to negotiate with Squad Omega or seeking alternative supply routes, the Korvaxi commander decided to launch a massive assault on what he believed to be their primary command center. Intelligence gathered through conventional reconnaissance had identified a facility in the Proxima system as Squad Omega's headquarters, and Thaxvor committed the majority of his remaining mobile forces to a decisive strike. The attack was a masterpiece of traditional military planning, with perfectly coordinated ground and space elements that would have overwhelmed any conventional defensive force. However, the facility that Squad Alpha destroyed with such devastating efficiency was merely one node in Squad Omega's distributed network. Marcus had learned from studying historical accounts of insurgent warfare on Earth, where decentralized resistance movements had proved remarkably resilient against conventional military forces. By distributing their command and control functions across dozens of small installations, Squad Omega had made themselves virtually impossible to defeat through traditional military action. The destruction of the Proxima facility actually strengthened Squad Omega's position by demonstrating to the other squads that conventional military thinking was inadequate to counter their strategy. Word spread quickly through the simulation's various factions that a new form of warfare was emerging, one that required entirely different approaches and capabilities. Squad Beta, commanded by the brilliant Valdorian strategist Telharan, was the first to recognize the implications and attempt to adapt. Rather than continuing their costly war with Squad Gamma over control of the industrial worlds, Terran proposed a temporary alliance aimed at containing Squad Omega's expansion before their economic network became completely unassailable. The alliance that formed between Squads Beta, Gamma, and Delta represented the simulation's equivalent of a coalition of great powers responding to an emerging threat. Marcus watched their coordination efforts with a mixture of admiration and concern, recognizing that his team now faced the combined military and economic resources of three major factions. However, the alliance also revealed the fundamental weakness in the traditional galactic approach to military cooperation. Each species brought their own doctrinal assumptions and cultural biases to the coalition, creating friction and inefficiency that Squad Omega could exploit. While the Allied forces possessed overwhelming numerical superiority, their inability to truly integrate their diverse approaches created opportunities for a more agile and unified opponent. Marcus convened his team for an emergency strategy session as reports arrived of massive fleet movements throughout the central systems. The coalition was preparing for a coordinated assault that would target Squad Omega's known installations while simultaneously establishing economic blockades to cut off their supply lines. They are adapting to our strategy more quickly than anticipated, Nextera observed, her harmonic tones carrying notes of concern. Our current economic advantages may not be sustainable against a truly coordinated response. Zixkala's analysis was characteristically direct. The coalition possesses sufficient resources to simply overwhelm our network through brute force, regardless of efficiency considerations. If they are willing to accept significant losses, they can break our economic stranglehold. Marcus studied the tactical display showing the coalition's force deployments, searching for weaknesses that Squad Omega could exploit. The alliance was indeed formidable, but it also represented a fundamental change in the simulation's dynamics that created new opportunities for unconventional thinking. What if we don't fight the coalition directly? Marcus asked. What if we instead focus on making their alliance unsustainable? The strategy that Marcus outlined drew inspiration from historical conflicts where smaller powers had achieved victory by undermining enemy alliances rather than defeating them militarily. Instead of meeting the coalition's assault head-on, Squad Omega would focus on creating tensions between the allied factions that would eventually tear the alliance apart. The key was understanding the fundamental motivations that drove each faction's participation in the coalition. Squad Beta's involvement was based on Terran's recognition that Squad Omega represented a long-term strategic threat to Valdorian expansion plans. Squad Gamma had joined primarily to prevent Squad Beta from gaining too much influence through solo action against Squad Omega. Squad Delta's participation was largely opportunistic, seeing the alliance as a chance to improve their position without bearing the primary costs of confrontation. Marcus proposed targeting the coalition's weakest links through a combination of economic incentives and strategic disinformation. Rather than simply defending their existing positions, Squad Omega would launch carefully planned operations designed to make continued alliance participation more costly for some members than others. The operation began with what appeared to be a strategic withdrawal from several key positions in the Outer Rim. Coalition intelligence interpreted this as evidence that Squad Omega was cracking under pressure, and Terran ordered an aggressive pursuit intended to prevent their opponents from regrouping in more defensible positions. However, the withdrawal was actually a carefully orchestrated deception designed to draw Squad Beta's forces into extended supply lines that Squad Omega could then target. As the Valdorian fleet advanced deeper into the Outer Rim, they found themselves increasingly dependent on logistics networks that passed through territories where Squad Omega maintained hidden influence. Simultaneously, Marcus launched a diplomatic initiative aimed at Squad Delta, offering them exclusive trading rights in several peripheral systems in exchange for reduced participation in coalition military operations. The offer was structured to appear as a sign of Squad Omega's desperation, while actually providing Squad Delta with economic benefits that exceeded anything they could gain through continued alliance participation. The psychological aspect of the operation was as important as its strategic elements. Marcus had studied each faction leader's personality and command style, identifying the specific pressures and incentives that would most effectively influence their decision-making processes. Telharen's pride in Valdorian strategic superiority made him particularly susceptible to operations that appeared to validate his tactical brilliance while actually leading him into traps. The first crack in the coalition appeared when Squad Gamma's commander, a pragmatic Thraxian named Zekvor, began questioning the wisdom of supporting Squad Beta's increasingly aggressive pursuit into the Outer Rim. Intelligence reports indicated that Squad Beta was suffering significant logistical problems, but Telharen's demand for continued support were placing similar strains on his allied partners. Marcus exploited this tension by launching a series of raids against Squad Gamma's home territories, carefully timed to coincide with moments when Squad Beta's forces were too distant to provide effective assistance. The raids themselves were minor, causing minimal actual damage, but they created the psychological pressure that Zekvor needed to justify reducing his commitment to coalition operations. The information warfare component of Squad Omega's strategy proved equally effective. Marcus had learned from studying human intelligence operations throughout history that perception often mattered more than reality in determining the outcome of conflicts. By carefully controlling the information available to different coalition members, Squad Omega could influence their decision-making processes in subtle but decisive ways. Intercepted communications between coalition commanders revealed growing frustration with the Alliance's inability to achieve decisive results against Squad Omega. Each faction leader believed that their allies were not fully committed to the effort, while simultaneously reducing their own participation to preserve resources for other priorities. The final blow to the coalition came when Squad Delta formally withdrew from the Alliance, citing their need to focus on defending against new threats in their home territories. The threats were largely imaginary, created through Squad Omega's sophisticated disinformation campaign, but Squad Delta's commander preferred the certainty of economic benefits offered by Marcus to the uncertain prospects of continued Alliance participation. With Squad Delta's withdrawal, the remaining coalition members found themselves facing a much more difficult strategic situation. Squad Omega's economic network had continued to expand during the Alliance's ineffective military operations, and their position was now significantly stronger than it had been before the coalition formed. Telharen, recognizing the continued pursuit of Squad Omega was becoming counterproductive, attempted to negotiate a separate peace that would allow Squad Beta to consolidate their existing gains while avoiding further losses. However, Marcus had anticipated this possibility and structured Squad Omega's previous operations to make such a settlement impossible without appearing weak to the other remaining factions. The collapse of the coalition marked a fundamental shift in the simulation's power balance. Squad Alpha, still trapped by the economic constraints that Squad Omega had imposed around the Kepler station, watched helplessly as their former allies abandoned the effort to contain humanity's rising influence. Faxwar's forces were now critically low on supplies, and facing the prospect of either surrender or catastrophic defeat in any major engagement. Marcus stood in Squad Omega's command center, watching the tactical display that showed their network of influence spreading throughout the simulation area. What had begun as a desperate strategy by an underestimated team had evolved into a demonstration of entirely new approaches to interstellar warfare. The traditional military doctrines that had dominated galactic thinking for millennia were proving inadequate against humanity's synthetic and adaptive approach to strategic challenges. However, Marcus also understood that their success had attracted attention beyond the confines of the wargame simulation. Reports indicated that senior military officials from across the galaxy were closely monitoring the exercise, and several had specifically requested detailed analysis of Squad Omega's unconventional tactics. The implications extended far beyond academic exercises. The Galactic Confederation faced real strategic challenges that traditional military thinking had proven unable to address effectively. Recent conflicts with rogue factions and external threats had demonstrated the limitations of conventional approaches, creating growing interest in alternative strategies and tactics. As the simulation entered its final phase, Marcus knew that Squad Omega's ultimate victory was now virtually guaranteed. Their economic and logistical control over the Outer Rim had become unassailable, while their opponents remained locked in traditional thinking patterns that prevented effective adaptation to the new paradigm. But victory in the war game was no longer Marcus's primary concern. He had begun to realize that their success represented something much larger than a clever tactical innovation. They had demonstrated that humanity's supposed weakness, their lack of established military traditions, might actually be their greatest strategic asset in a galaxy where other species were constrained by the very doctrines that had brought them historical success. The aftermath of Squad Omega's unprecedented victory in the war games reverberated through the Galactic Defense Institute like shock waves from a stellar explosion. For the first time in the Academy's 3,000-year history, a team of supposedly inferior cadets had achieved total strategic dominance using methods that challenged every fundamental assumption of galactic military doctrine. Marcus Chun found himself at the center of a storm of attention that he had never anticipated. Senior instructors who had previously dismissed him as an unremarkable human now sought private meetings to discuss his tactical innovations. Representatives from military academies across the galaxy requested copies of his strategic analysis. Most significantly, rumors circulated that Admiral Vextera herself, the legendary Ashcore commander who oversaw the entire Galactic Defense Institute, had specifically requested a personal briefing on Squad Omega's methods. The formal debriefing session took place in the Institute's Grand Auditorium, a vast chamber capable of accommodating thousands of beings from dozens of different species. The assembled audience included not only the Academy's instructors and cadets, but also visiting military officials, strategic analysts, and media representatives from across the Confederation. The attention was unprecedented for what had originally been intended as a routine training exercise. Commander SYX Tall stood at the central podium, his scarred features bearing an expression of barely concealed amazement as he began his analysis of the war games. Behind him, massive holographic displays showed the evolution of Squad Omega's strategy from their initial peripheral positioning through their ultimate achievement of galactic dominance within the simulation. In 4,700 previous war game scenarios conducted at this institute, the commander began, victory has invariably gone to the team that most effectively implemented traditional military doctrine adapted to the specific conditions of the exercise. Strategy has been a matter of superior execution rather than fundamental innovation. He gestured to the tactical displays showing Squad Omega's unconventional approach. Squad Omega achieved victory not through superior implementation of established doctrine, but through the creation of an entirely new paradigm that rendered traditional military thinking obsolete within the parameters of their operation. The analysis that followed was exhaustive, with detailed examination of every aspect of Squad Omega's strategy. Military theorists had spent days studying Marcus's approach, attempting to understand how a team of supposedly inferior cadets had achieved results that challenged centuries of established wisdom. The economic warfare component received particular attention, as it represented a complete departure from the direct military confrontation that dominated galactic strategic thinking. Professor Vex Khan, the Institute's leading expert on military economics, presented calculations showing how Squad Omega's control over peripheral trade routes had generated more strategic leverage than traditional military conquest of central systems. The human cadet, Chun, demonstrated an understanding of economic military integration that exceeds the capabilities of officers with decades of experience in traditional strategic roles, Vex Khan observed. His synthesis of commercial and military objectives created force multipliers that no amount of conventional military strength could match. Equally significant was Squad Omega's information warfare campaign, which had exploited psychological and cultural differences between species to undermine the coalition that should have easily defeated them. Dr. Yethaler, a renowned expert in interspecies psychology, analyzed how Marcus had identified and targeted the specific cognitive biases that affected each faction's decision-making processes. The Terran's approach required not only understanding each species' military capabilities, but also their fundamental psychological drivers and cultural assumptions, Dr. Yethaler explained. This level of multi-species analysis typically requires decades of study and direct experience that no first-year cadet should possess. Marcus sat in the front row with his Squad Omega teammates, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the attention focused upon him. The analysis being presented made their victory sound far more sophisticated and calculated than it had felt during the actual exercise. Much of what the experts interpreted as brilliant strategic insight had actually been desperate improvisation combined with techniques he had learned from studying human military history. The questions that followed the formal presentation revealed the depth of confusion that Squad Omega's success had created within the galactic military establishment. Officers who had spent their entire careers mastering traditional doctrine struggled to understand how such well-established principles could have been rendered ineffective by what they persisted in viewing as amateur innovation. General Courthacks of the Thraxian Defense Force posed a question that many were thinking, but few dared ask directly. How do we explain the failure of time-tested military doctrine against methods developed by cadets with no practical combat experience? Are we to abandon principles that have served us effectively for millennia based on the results of a single simulation? The question hung in the air like a challenge, representing the fundamental crisis of confidence that Squad Omega's victory had created. Marcus felt hundreds of eyes focused upon him, waiting for an explanation that he wasn't sure he could provide. The truth was that he had never intended to revolutionize galactic military thinking. He had simply been trying to find a way for his underestimated team to compete effectively against superior opponents. Admiral Crexthon of the Valdorian Space Command offered a different perspective that seemed designed to minimize the implications of the exercise results. Perhaps we should consider that simulation parameters create artificial constraints that do not reflect the realities of actual warfare. Victory in controlled exercises does not necessarily translate to effectiveness in genuine combat situations. The comment sparked immediate debate among the assembled military officials. Representatives from different species began arguing about the validity of using simulation results to evaluate real-world strategic capabilities, with some suggesting that Squad Omega's success was merely an artifact of the specific scenario parameters rather than evidence of superior tactical innovation. Marcus found himself growing frustrated with the direction of the discussion. The military establishment seemed determined to find ways to dismiss their achievement rather than learning from it, apparently unable to accept that their fundamental assumptions might be flawed. "Permission to respond, sir?" Marcus asked, rising from his seat despite the breach of protocol that interrupting senior officers represented. Commander Swyxtal looked surprised but nodded his approval. The floor recognizes Cadet Chun. Marcus moved to the central speaking area, acutely aware that his next words would be scrutinized by some of the most powerful military figures in the galaxy. He had never addressed such an audience before, but the dismissive attitudes he was hearing reminded him of the prejudices he had faced throughout his time at the Academy. Respectfully, the simulation parameters were the same for all participants. Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast auditorium. If those parameters created artificial advantages for unconventional strategies, then traditional doctrine should have adapted to exploit those same advantages. He gestured to the tactical displays, still showing the progression of the war games. Squad Omega's success was not the result of gaming the system or exploiting artificial constraints. We simply approached the problem from a different perspective, one that wasn't limited by assumptions about how warfare should be conducted. The silence that followed was profound, with hundreds of seasoned military officers processing the implications of being lectured on strategic thinking by a 19-year-old human cadet. Marcus could see expressions ranging from outrage to curiosity, but he pressed on with his analysis. The galaxy's military thinking has become constrained by tradition and specialization. Each species has perfected their own approach to warfare, but that perfection has become a limitation that prevents adaptation to new challenges. Humans don't have established military traditions that constrain our thinking, which allows us to synthesize approaches from multiple sources. Dr. Yethaler leaned forward with obvious interest. Are you suggesting that humanity's lack of military history is actually a strategic advantage? Marcus considered the question carefully before responding. I'm suggesting that adaptation requires the ability to think beyond existing paradigms. Every military tradition in the galaxy developed in response to specific historical circumstances and challenges. When those circumstances change, rigid adherence to traditional methods becomes a liability rather than an asset. The discussion that followed Marcus's presentation continued for hours, with military theorists and strategic analysts debating the implications of his arguments. Some dismissed his ideas as the untested theories of an inexperienced cadet, while others recognized the potential for genuine innovation in his synthetic approach to strategic thinking. However, the debate was interrupted by an announcement that sent shock waves through the assembled gathering. Admiral Vexterra, the Supreme Commander of the Galactic Defense Institute, and one of the most respected military figures in known space, had arrived and requested an immediate private audience with Squad Omega. The Admiral's presence at the Institute was unprecedented. As an Ashkor of the warrior caste, she normally remained in the distant star systems of her people, emerging only during the most serious military crises. Her arrival suggested that Squad Omega's victory had attracted attention at the highest levels of galactic military command. Marcus and his teammates were escorted to a secure conference room where Admiral Vexterra waited alone. The Ashkor Admiral was an imposing figure, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with the characteristic silver-scaled skin and piercing violet eyes of her species. Her reputation as both a warrior and a strategic genius was legendary throughout the galaxy, and Marcus felt intimidated despite his recent success. Cadet Chun, the Admiral spoke in perfect Standard Galactic, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. Your performance in the war games has been brought to my attention by sources beyond this academy. I am here to discuss matters of far greater significance than academic exercises. She activated a holographic display showing star charts that Marcus didn't recognize, with tactical markings that suggested ongoing military operations rather than historical analysis. The scope of the display encompassed regions far beyond the Galactic Confederation's normal sphere of influence. The Confederation faces threats that traditional military doctrine has proven inadequate to address, Admiral Vexterra continued. Rogue factions utilizing unconventional warfare methods have achieved significant success against our conventional forces. More concerning are intelligence reports suggesting the emergence of external threats that our current strategic paradigms cannot effectively counter. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he realized the implications of the Admiral's words. The War Games exercise was not just an academic curiosity. It was potentially relevant to real strategic challenges facing the galaxy. Your tactical innovations during the exercise demonstrated approaches that could prove valuable in addressing these emerging threats, the Admiral explained. However, implementation of such strategies requires more than theoretical understanding. It demands practical experience and the authority to implement changes that will be resisted by established military hierarchies. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in before continuing. The Ashkor Council has been monitoring human development since your species joined the Confederation. We believe that humanity's adaptive capabilities and synthetic thinking may be crucial to galactic security in the conflicts that are approaching. The Admiral's revelation was stunning in its implications. Marcus had assumed that humanity's role in galactic affairs was primarily economic and technological, contributing industrial capacity and innovation to the Confederation while leaving military affairs to more established species. The suggestion that human strategic thinking might be crucial to galactic security represented a complete reversal of the assumptions that had guided his understanding of interstellar politics. "What exactly are you proposing, Admiral?" Grakhan asked, his warrior's instincts clearly intrigued by the prospect of genuine combat application for their strategic innovations. Admiral Vextera's response would change not only their own futures, but potentially the balance of power throughout the galaxy. "I am proposing that Squad Omega be transferred to a classified military program designed to develop and test unconventional warfare capabilities. Your success in the war games was impressive, but it was only the beginning of what may be required to ensure the Confederation's survival." The offer represented an opportunity that none of them had dared to imagine. Instead of completing their education as junior officers in the conventional military hierarchy, they would be working directly with the galaxy's most elite military units on challenges that could determine the fate of civilized space. However, Marcus also recognized the enormous responsibility that such an assignment would entail. The strategies they had developed during the war games were untested in real combat situations, and the consequences of failure would extend far beyond academic embarrassment. "The decision must be made immediately," Admiral Vextera continued. "The external threats I mentioned are accelerating their activities, and conventional responses have proven inadequate. If humanity's strategic capabilities are to be properly integrated into Confederation defense planning, that integration must begin now." Marcus looked at his teammates, seeing his own mixture of excitement and apprehension reflected in their expressions. Zixkala's mandibles clicked nervously as he processed the magnitude of the opportunity. Nextera's harmonic communications carried undertones of both ambition and concern. Grakhan simply nodded with the straightforward acceptance of a warrior presented with a worthy challenge. The choice would define not only their individual careers, but potentially humanity's role in galactic military affairs for generations to come. Marcus understood that accepting Admiral Vextera's offer would mark the beginning of a journey far more complex and dangerous than anything they had experienced in the controlled environment of the Academy. But it would also represent vindication of everything he had believed about humanity's potential contribution to galactic civilization. The species that had been mocked and dismissed as primitive newcomers might be exactly what the galaxy needed to face the challenges that lay ahead. 6 months after accepting Admiral Vextera's offer, Marcus Chun stood aboard the bridge of the experimental vessel Synthesis, watching through reinforced viewports as an entire star system burned under the assault of an enemy that defied every conventional understanding of warfare. The Devourers, as intelligence reports had designated them, represented a threat unlike anything the Galactic Confederation had faced in its 3,000-year history. The classified military program that Squad Omega had joined operated from a hidden base in the Void Reaches, a region of space so remote that its existence was known only to the highest levels of Confederation command. The facility itself was a marvel of engineering, combining technologies from dozens of species to create a research and development center capable of supporting the most advanced military experiments in known space. Marcus and his team had spent months working with elite specialists from across the galaxy, refining their unconventional strategies and adapting them for real-world application. The program director, a brilliant Valdorian strategist named Commander Telvash, had pushed them beyond their academic understanding into the harsh realities of asymmetric warfare against opponents who possessed overwhelming technological advantages. The Synthesis itself embodied the program's innovative approach to military challenges. Rather than following traditional design philosophies that emphasized either overwhelming firepower or impenetrable defenses, the vessel had been constructed around adaptability and deception. Its hull could reshape itself to mimic different ship classes, Its sensor signature could be modified to confuse enemy targeting systems, and its weapons systems could fire projectiles that behaved in unpredictable ways. However, all their theoretical preparation had proved inadequate when the Devourers finally revealed themselves in force. The enemy's first major assault had targeted the Xerian system, a heavily defended industrial center that should have been capable of resisting any conventional attack. Instead, the defenders had been overwhelmed within hours by opponents who seemed to ignore the basic laws of physics that govern normal space warfare. Status report on the Xerian defense platforms? Marcus requested, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the expressions on his crew's faces. Lieutenant Yexkala, the Valdorian communications specialist who had replaced Nextera when she was transferred to intelligence analysis, responded with characteristic precision despite the grim nature of her report. All primary defense stations have gone silent. The last transmission indicated that enemy vessels were somehow passing through their defensive shields without causing any disruption to the barrier fields. The tactical impossibility of the situation represented everything that made the Devourers so dangerous. They appeared to possess technologies that allowed them to selectively ignore fundamental physical laws, making conventional defensive strategies completely worthless. Energy barriers that could stop any known form of projectile or energy beam seemed to offer no protection against weapons that could somehow exist in the same space without interaction. Marcus studied the long-range sensor data showing the progression of the assault, searching for patterns that might reveal weaknesses in the enemy's seemingly invincible capabilities. The Devourers' ships defied conventional classification, appearing as geometric constructs that shifted between different configurations without any visible mechanism driving the transformations. Have we received any word from Admiral Vextera regarding the deployment of conventional reinforcements? Asked Chief Grakon, who now served as the synthesis's tactical coordinator. The question highlighted one of the most frustrating aspects of their situation. Despite the obvious inadequacy of traditional military responses to the Devourer threat, Confederation Command remained reluctant to authorize full implementation of the unconventional strategies that Marcus's team had developed. Political considerations and institutional inertia continued to constrain their ability to respond effectively to an enemy that recognized no such limitations. The Admiral's last communication indicated that conventional forces are being held in reserve pending better intelligence on enemy capabilities. Marcus replied diplomatically. The reality was that most senior commanders still refused to acknowledge that traditional military doctrine was fundamentally inadequate to address the Devourer threat. The only exception was Admiral Vextera herself, whose Ashkor warrior culture valued adaptability over tradition. She had privately authorized the synthesis to operate independently, with broad discretionary authority to engage the enemy using whatever methods proved most effective. However, this independence came with the understanding that success was the only acceptable outcome, as failure would likely result in the termination of the entire experimental program. Incoming transmission from Deep Space Monitoring Station Theta-7 announced Ensign Zixtal, the young Thraxian who served as the vessel's sensor specialist. They're reporting massive energy signatures approaching the Kepler system. Marcus felt his blood run cold as he processed the implications. The Kepler system contained not only major industrial facilities, but also one of the Confederation's primary military academies, including thousands of cadets who represented the future leadership of galactic civilization. If the Devourers targeted Kepler with the same devastating effectiveness they had demonstrated at Xerion, the casualties would be catastrophic. Time to intercept if we alter course immediately? Marcus asked, already knowing that the mathematics would be unfavorable. 17 hours at maximum acceleration. Chief Grakon responded after quick calculations. However, based on previous Devourer assault patterns, we estimate the attack will commence within 12 hours of their arrival. The time constraint meant that conventional military response was impossible. Even if Admiral Vextera immediately dispatched the nearest battle fleet, they would arrive hours after the attack had concluded. The synthesis was the only Confederation vessel in position to potentially affect the outcome, but a single experimental ship could hardly be expected to succeed where entire fleets had failed. However, Marcus had learned from studying human military history that conventional thinking about force ratios and tactical capabilities often proved inadequate when facing truly innovative strategies. The key was not to match the enemy's strengths, but to identify and exploit weaknesses that they might not even recognize themselves. Analysis of previous Devourer attacks suggests a consistent pattern in their operational approach. Marcus observed, calling up tactical displays that showed the progression of enemy assaults across multiple star systems. They appear to prioritize complete destruction over territorial control, suggesting that their strategic objectives may be fundamentally different from conventional military conquest. Lieutenant Yexkala's harmonic analysis carried notes of curiosity as she responded. Their apparent disregard for captured resources and infrastructure indicates that they may not be seeking to expand their own civilization in any traditional sense. The complete annihilation approach suggests either religious or ideological motivations rather than practical conquest objectives. The observation sparked an idea that Marcus had been developing since their first encounter with Devourer forces. If the enemy's primary motivation was destruction rather than conquest, they might be vulnerable to strategies that exploited their single-minded focus on annihilation. An opponent who ignored everything except their primary objective could potentially be manipulated through careful application of deception and misdirection. What if we don't try to stop their attack on Kepler? Marcus asked, causing his entire bridge crew to stare at him in shock. What if we instead try to redirect it toward a target that serves our strategic objectives? The concept that Marcus outlined drew inspiration from ancient human military strategies, where smaller forces had achieved victory by manipulating much larger opponents into attacking objectives that ultimately served the defender's interests. Rather than meeting the Devourers in direct confrontation, the synthesis would attempt to deceive them into attacking a location where their destructive capabilities could be turned against themselves. The plan required split-second timing and perfect coordination, with no possibility of backup support if any element failed. Marcus would use the synthesis's advanced deception capabilities to create false sensor readings that would make the Devourers believe that a nearby binary star system contained a much more valuable target than the actual Kepler system. The binary stars in the Proxima Centauri system are approaching a natural instability phase, Chief Grokon observed as he analyzed the stellar mechanics involved in Marcus's proposed deception. If the Devourer's planet-killing weapons were to destabilize the gravitational balance at precisely the right moment, the resulting stellar explosion would create a chain reaction capable of destroying any vessels within several light hours of the system. Lieutenant Yexkala's harmonic communications carried undertones of amazement as she processed the implications. You propose to use the enemy's own destructive capabilities to eliminate their forces while simultaneously protecting the Kepler system. The deception would need to be absolutely perfect, as any detection of our manipulation would result in them simply ignoring the false target. The technical challenges were enormous, requiring the synthesis to simultaneously maintain multiple layers of deception while positioning themselves to survive the stellar explosion they hoped to trigger. Marcus's crew would need to perform with precision that exceeded anything they had achieved during training exercises, knowing that failure would likely result in not only their own deaths, but the destruction of everything they had sworn to protect. However, the alternative was accepting certain defeat against an enemy whose capabilities made conventional resistance futile. Marcus had learned from studying humanity's greatest military victories that sometimes the only path to success required accepting risks that more cautious commanders would consider unacceptable. All stations prepare for emergency acceleration. Marcus commanded as the synthesis began its desperate race toward the Proxima Centauri system. We have 6 hours to position ourselves and establish the deception matrix before the Devourer forces arrive at Kepler. The next 6 hours tested every system and every crew member aboard the Synthesis beyond their design limitations. The vessel's experimental adaptive hull allowed them to maintain structural integrity while accelerating at rates that would have destroyed conventional ships, but the physical stress on the organic crew members approached dangerous levels. Marcus remained on the bridge throughout the acceleration phase, monitoring the complex preparations required for their deception operation while maintaining communication with Admiral Vextura and the commanders responsible for evacuating non-essential personnel from the Kepler system. The Admiral had accepted his plan with a grim recognition that no conventional alternative offered any hope of success. Sensor ghost projectors online and calibrated reported Ensign Zixtal as the Synthesis approached their planned position near the binary stars. We can maintain the illusion of a major industrial complex for approximately 3 hours before power reserves become critical. Lieutenant Yexkala added her own status report. Communication intercept systems are ready to broadcast false distress signals and military coordination chatter that should reinforce the enemy's belief that they have identified a high-value target. The most critical element was Chief Grakon's analysis of the stellar mechanics that would determine whether their plan could actually work. The binary stars were indeed approaching an instability phase, but triggering the chain reaction would require the Devourer weapons to strike specific points with precise timing that Marcus's team could only estimate. Target zones identified and marked, Grakon announced. If the enemy follows their standard attack pattern, their bombardment should begin with the outer defensive installations before proceeding to the primary industrial targets. We will have approximately 17 minutes to monitor their weapon effects and determine whether the stellar destabilization is proceeding as calculated. 17 minutes to determine whether their desperate gamble would save the Kepler system or simply add the Synthesis to the list of casualties in humanity's first major engagement with the Devourers. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility more intensely than ever before, knowing that the success or failure of their mission would likely determine whether the Confederation survived the war that was clearly approaching. Long-range sensors detected the arrival of Devourer forces at the edge of the Proxima Centauri system exactly when Marcus's calculations had predicted. The enemy formation consisted of 7 of the geometric constructs that served as their primary assault vessels, each one capable of destroying entire planets through methods that remained incomprehensible to Confederation science. Enemy forces are adjusting course toward our projected target zone. Ensign Zixtal reported with barely contained excitement. They appear to have accepted our deception completely. However, Marcus knew that the most dangerous phase of their operation was just beginning. The Devourers would need to position themselves within the stellar system in a way that made them vulnerable to the explosion they were about to trigger, while the Synthesis would need to maintain their deception while simultaneously preparing to escape the same explosion. The balance between success and catastrophic failure would be measured in seconds, with no margin for error and no possibility of retreat if their calculations proved incorrect. The moment when the first Devourer weapon struck, the carefully calculated target point marked the beginning of the most intense 17 minutes in Marcus Chen's life. The stellar mechanics unfolded exactly as Chief Grakon had predicted, with the binary star's gravitational dance beginning to destabilize in ways that would culminate in a chain reaction of unprecedented magnitude. Marcus watched the tactical displays with crystalline focus, knowing that every second of delay in their escape sequence would exponentially increase their chances of being consumed by the stellar explosion they had engineered. However, premature departure would allow the Devourers to detect their deception and potentially escape the trap that represented the Confederation's best hope of achieving victory against their seemingly invincible enemy. Stellar disruption is proceeding within acceptable parameters, Grakon reported, his warriors' training allowing him to maintain professional calm despite the magnitude of the forces they were attempting to control. Primary star is showing signs of helium flash instability, which should cascade to the secondary star within 8 minutes. The Devourer forces had positioned themselves exactly where Marcus's plan required, apparently convinced that they were attacking a major industrial complex rather than triggering their own destruction. Their geometric vessels continued their methodical bombardment pattern, each weapon strike adding to the stellar destabilization without their recognition of what they were actually accomplishing. Enemy communication intercepts suggest they remain focused entirely on target destruction, reported Lieutenant Yexkala, her harmonic analysis carrying notes of amazement at the effectiveness of their deception. They appear to interpret the stellar phenomena as defensive measures deployed by the facility they believe they are attacking. Marcus felt a surge of grim satisfaction at the report, but he also knew that their success was far from guaranteed. Even if the stellar explosion proceeded as planned, the synthesis would still need to escape a blast zone that would extend across multiple star systems. The experimental vessel's advanced capabilities provided their only hope of survival, but those capabilities had never been tested under such extreme conditions. Prepare for emergency departure sequence, Marcus commanded as the countdown approached its final phase. All crew members to acceleration stations. Chief Grakon, initiate maximum power transfer to propulsion systems. The next few minutes stretched like hours as the synthesis's crew completed their escape preparations while monitoring the progressive destabilization of the binary star system. Marcus forced himself to wait until the last possible moment, knowing that premature departure would risk allowing some of the Devourer forces to escape the explosion. Primary star entering critical instability phase, Grakon announced. Helium flash cascade beginning. Estimate 4 minutes until secondary star reaches critical mass. All Devourer vessels remain within the primary blast radius. Added Ensign Zixtal. They show no signs of recognizing the stellar threat or attempting to withdraw from the system. Marcus took a deep breath and made the decision that would determine whether they lived or died. Execute emergency departure. Maximum acceleration on Vector 77 Mark IV. Engage all defensive systems. The synthesis leaped away from the binary system like a projectile fired from an impossibly powerful weapon. The vessel's adaptive hull reconfigured itself to minimize resistance, while its exotic propulsion systems pushed acceleration rates beyond anything that conventional engineering thought possible. Every member of the crew endured crushing forces that tested the limits of their species' physiology. Behind them, the binary stars reached the critical phase that Marcus's calculations had predicted with terrifying accuracy. The primary star's helium flash triggered a gravitational wave that destabilized its companion, creating a cascade effect that rapidly exceeded the binding energy holding both stellar masses together. The explosion that followed was visible across dozens of neighboring star systems, a brief new star that announced the complete annihilation of everything within a sphere of space larger than most stellar nations. Shock wave approaching, Grakon reported through gritted teeth as the synthesis fled the expanding zone of destruction. Impact in 47 seconds. All structural systems show green, but we are operating beyond rated parameters. The shock wave that caught them was like nothing that any starship had ever been designed to withstand. Energy densities that could sterilize entire worlds washed over the synthesis's hull, while gravitational distortions twisted space itself in ways that challenged the vessel's structural integrity. For several terrifying minutes, Marcus wasn't certain whether they would survive their own victory. When the emergency finally passed and normal space reasserted itself around them, the synthesis had been hurled nearly 3 light-years from their original position. The vessel's systems showed damage throughout, but nothing that couldn't be repaired given sufficient time and resources. More importantly, long-range sensors confirmed that no trace remained of the Devourer force that had threatened the Kepler system. Message from Admiral Vextera, Lieutenant Yexkala, announced as communications systems came back online. The Kepler system reports all clear. No enemy forces detected on approach vectors. The Admiral is requesting immediate debriefing on our engagement results. Marcus slumped back in his command chair, feeling the weight of exhaustion and relief in equal measure. They had achieved something that conventional military wisdom insisted was impossible, destroying a superior enemy force through strategy and deception rather than raw firepower. However, he also understood that their victory was only the beginning of a much larger conflict. The debriefing session that followed their return to the hidden base in the Void Reaches lasted for days, with military analysts from across the Confederation studying every aspect of their engagement with the Devourers. Marcus found himself once again at the center of attention from senior officers who struggled to understand how such an unconventional approach had succeeded where traditional military doctrine had failed. Admiral Vexterra presided over the analysis sessions with the same intense focus that had made her legendary throughout galactic military circles. The Ash Corps commander's questions probed not only the technical details of their operation, but also the underlying strategic principles that had guided their decision-making process. The stellar manipulation strategy represents a completely new category of military operation, the Admiral observed during one session. However, its success was dependent upon specific environmental conditions that may not be available in future engagements. How do you propose to adapt your approach for operations in different stellar configurations? The question highlighted the fundamental challenge facing Marcus and his team as they transitioned from experimental success to operational doctrine. Their victory had proven that unconventional strategies could defeat the Devourers, but it had also demonstrated the complexity and risk inherent in such approaches. The specific tactics will vary based on available resources and environmental factors, Marcus replied. But the underlying strategic principle remains constant. Identify and exploit the enemy's behavioral patterns and psychological assumptions to create opportunities that conventional analysis would miss. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked with specialists from across the galaxy to develop a comprehensive doctrine for asymmetric warfare against technologically superior opponents. The new approaches drew inspiration not only from human military history, but also from the unique strategic traditions of dozens of different species, creating synthesis that transcended any single cultural or biological perspective. The breakthrough that transformed their experimental success into a galactic defense strategy came from an unexpected source. Kythera the Unbroken, the legendary Ash Corps warrior whose historical analysis had first inspired Marcus's unconventional thinking, requested a personal meeting to discuss the implications of the synthesis's victory. The meeting took place aboard Kythera's personal vessel, a ship that embodied the Ash Corps philosophy of adaptive warfare. Unlike the standardized designs favored by most galactic militaries, her vessel appeared to have been constructed from components representing dozens of different technological traditions, creating a unique hybrid that combined the best features of multiple engineering approaches. Kythera herself was even more impressive in person than Marcus had imagined from studying historical records. The Ash Corps warrior possessed a presence that commanded immediate respect, with intelligence that seemed to analyze and catalog every detail of their environment. Her reputation as an undefeated combatant was evident in every movement, but Marcus was even more struck by the strategic brilliance that radiated from her like a tangible force. Your victory against the Devourers represents more than tactical innovation, Kythera began without preliminary conversation. It demonstrates that the galaxy's approach to military affairs has become fundamentally inadequate to address emerging threats. Traditional doctrine assumes that technological superiority translates directly to military advantage, but your success proves that assumption false. She activated a star chart showing the current strategic situation across the galaxy, with threat indicators marking the locations of confirmed Devourer activity. The scope of enemy operations was far larger than public announcements had indicated, with attacks occurring simultaneously across multiple sectors in patterns that suggested coordinated strategy rather than random raids. The Devourers are not merely another military opponent, Kythera continued. They represent a fundamental challenge to the assumptions that underlie galactic civilization. Their technology appears to operate according to physical principles that our science cannot explain, making conventional military responses ineffective. Marcus studied the strategic display, recognizing patterns that reminded him of his own approach to asymmetric warfare. The Devourers seemed to be exploiting the Confederation's reliance on predictable defensive strategies, striking at targets that should have been secure while avoiding confrontations where conventional military strength could be effectively deployed. "You believe they're using our own strategic assumptions against us," Marcus observed, "just like we did with the Coalition during the War Games." Kithra's expression showed approval at his analysis. "Precisely. But understanding their strategy is only the first step toward developing effective countermeasures. The question is whether the Confederation can adapt its military doctrine quickly enough to address a threat that evolves faster than traditional institutions can respond. The solution that emerged from their discussion would require unprecedented cooperation between species that had maintained separate military traditions for millennia. Instead of trying to create a unified command structure that would inevitably be constrained by political and cultural differences, Marcus proposed developing a network of specialized units that could operate independently while sharing intelligence and coordinating their activities through informal channels. Each unit would be composed of personnel from multiple species, trained in the synthetic strategic approaches that Marcus's team had pioneered. They would operate using the adaptive technologies exemplified by the synthesis, with authority to engage enemy forces using whatever methods proved most effective regardless of whether those methods conform to established military doctrine. The Confederation's survival requires abandoning the institutional structures that have defined galactic military affairs for thousands of years, Kithra concluded. Traditional command hierarchies and standardized operational procedures create predictability that our enemies can exploit. Victory demands organizational flexibility that most military establishments consider anathema. The formal proposal that Marcus submitted to Admiral Vexterra represented nothing less than a complete transformation of how the galaxy approached military challenges. Instead of massive fleets operating according to established doctrine, the new paradigm emphasized small, adaptive units that could respond to threats using methods that transcended species-specific limitations. The Admiral's response came in the form of a personal summons to present his proposal directly to the Ashkor High Council, the secretive governing body that coordinated military affairs for the galaxy's most elite warrior culture. The invitation was unprecedented for a human, representing recognition that Marcus's strategic innovations had earned him a place among the galaxy's most respected military theorists. The journey to the Ashkor homeworld took Marcus through regions of space that few non-Ashkor had ever seen, past stellar phenomena that serve as natural barriers protecting the warrior culture's isolation from galactic politics. The homeworld itself was a marvel of defensive engineering, with orbital installations that could have single-handedly defeated most invasion fleets while maintaining the appearance of peaceful research facilities. The High Council chamber was a stark space that reflected the Ashkor philosophy of functional elegance over decorative display. The council members themselves represented the finest military minds in the galaxy, with combat experience spanning conflicts that most species considered legendary history. The proposal submitted by the human Marcus Chun represents a fundamental departure from established strategic doctrine, announced Council Leader Thexvala as the session began. Implementation would require abandoning military traditions that have served our civilizations effectively for millennia. The Council must determine whether such radical changes are justified by the threat we face. The debate that followed lasted for hours, with Council members analyzing every aspect of Marcus's proposals from perspectives that encompass thousands of years of military experience. Some argued that traditional approaches simply required refinement rather than replacement, while others contended that the devourer threat demanded completely new paradigms. The decisive moment came when Kithra herself rose to address the Council, her legendary status commanding immediate attention from even the most senior military leaders. The young human has achieved what none of our established military doctrines could accomplish, she declared. He has demonstrated that adaptation and Synthesis can defeat opponents whose technological advantages should have made victory impossible. More importantly, he has shown that our survival depends not on perfecting traditional methods, but on transcending the limitations they impose. Her endorsement carried weight that no amount of tactical analysis could match. When Kithara, the Unbroken, declared that Marcus Chen's strategic innovations represented the galaxy's best hope for survival, the High Council's decision was inevitable. The authorization that emerged from the Council session granted Marcus unprecedented authority to implement his adaptive warfare doctrine throughout the Confederation's military forces. He would oversee the creation of a new type of military unit that combined personnel from multiple species with technologies that transcended traditional engineering limitations. More significantly, the Council formally recognized humanity's strategic contributions as essential to galactic defense, marking the end of the prejudices that had dismissed human military potential. The species that had been